Default setting of strategy execution is failure. At least that's what the data seems to suggest. In our first videos, we explored the history of solutions to the strategy execution gap, but after all of that, do we actually understand what makes strategy succeed? In our investigation so far, we've uncovered a few important things, so let's recap those. Strategy success rates can be as low as getting into NASA or winning small lottery. For decades, researchers and leaders have proposed solutions, and yet the problem still persists. We've seen repeating patterns across what looks like one-off problems, which suggests they are not really one-off at all, but part of something bigger. And if these patterns are symptoms, then there must be an underlying cause. One possible explanation: a hidden structure of the organization, one that shapes human behavior, that leads to an intriguing possibility. What if the answers to those recurring problems are hiding in plain sight? Things we experience every single day but rarely name. Office politics, cultural norms, socially accepted behaviors, incentives, power dynamics. But before we dive deeper into what those dynamics are, we need to step back. Because so far we've talked about strategy, but we haven't actually defined the process of strategy execution itself. And if we don't understand this process, then how can we try to fix it? So, we know the strategy has to move through an organization to be executed. But how exactly? This is where the 3 layers of successful strategy execution come in. Layer 1, strategy design, the planning phase, understanding resources, aligning long-term goals, designing the perfect plan. Layer 2, implementation, where plans turn into action, processes, responsibilities, communication, collaboration, monitoring. Layer 3, everyday behavior, the most overlooked and often most decisive layer, daily actions, habits, decisions that actually determine whether strategy happens or not. All 3 must work together. Break one, and the whole strategy stalls. Let's walk through them all. We start at the top, strategy design. And this matters more than it might seem. Because if the strategy itself is flawed, no amount of execution effort will fix it. In that case, failure isn't surprising. It's expected, designed. In this phase, all the classic tools help. Porter's 5 forces, BCG matrix, scenario planning, SMART goals, balanced scorecard. And most of you know what this phase looks like. You're analyzing data, markets, you're setting objectives, KPI, assigning responsibilities, defining timelines, budgets, and resources. And then, eventually, it all comes together into a clean, polished plan. And then, execution begins. But before any of that, there are deeper questions you should answer here as well. Why this goal? Does it align with the long-term vision of our company? Does it support or conflict with your core values? Do you actually have the resources to pursue it? Because if people are already stretched thin and then you add more work without acknowledging the previous one, then the real cost of that strategy is hidden from the start and making it impossible to execute from the start. So this is the groundwork, the part that determines whether the strategy even makes sense to pursue. Once it's done, you move into the design of the strategy. But one thing is critical here. Prioritization in relation to resources. Because if everything is a priority, then nothing is. 5 strategic goals, all critical for the same group of people? That's not strategy, that's a wish list. But let's assume you've got it right. You designed the quote-unquote perfect plan aligned with vision, market, your resources, translated into clear objectives. Now comes the real test. Layer 2, implementation. Now we have a plan. For it to succeed, it must be implemented. And this layer is where that happens, at least visible part of it. So this layer includes communication, coordination, engagement, collaboration, and tracking progress. So let's start with something simple. Communication. At the top level, strategy is often very clear. They are the ones that are creating it. But as it moves down the organization, it becomes less and less concrete. So, for example, say increase sales by 15% within 2 quarters. Sounds clear, but for the team responsible, it raises more questions than answers. How exactly? With what resources? Should we shift priorities? What should we remove? Should we stop something? Do we need support from other teams? Do they have the resources? In the face of uncertainty and unclear rules, people will default to what makes sense to them. So even if that made sense to you, it may not to them. And one of the most important tasks in this layer is to align the role of responsibility and ownership. What does it mean? Well, let's use our example of the dinner party. So, imagine you're told in 2 hours you need to host a dinner party for 20 people. You have 1 pack of pasta, 3 potatoes, and some mayo. No budget, so you can't buy groceries, hire a chef, or even order more food. You can't ask anyone to help you. No way to extend the time. You're expected to deliver a feast. What do you do? How do you even begin? Well, you don't. Because this isn't about effort or skill, it's about structure. You're being asked to succeed in a system that simply doesn't allow it. And this is also the layer where the patterns begin to emerge as the symptoms of the underlying system. So, the visible problems we often deal with can be waiting for decisions, leads to the overload center problem, defaulting to old routines, the polite misalignment, miscommunication, the silo effect. So the implementation system is supposed to be the bridge from strategy to execution. Yet, even with clear objectives, if the structure misaligns responsibility, authority, and information, the strategy cannot flow. And then, of course, we cannot forget about the constant monitoring, tracking, and adjusting of the metrics and situation that needs to happen. And while this should be an obvious thing, the idea of metric tracking is quite embedded in most leaders' and employees' minds. The data shows a different story. Research shows that 85% of leadership teams spend less than 1 hour per month discussing strategy. To me, this statistic is wild, and it also shows another crack in how we approach strategy. Because it's easy to consider strategy a once-done plan that you just need to follow. But strategy is plan made in specific point in time, with specific but incomplete information meant to work over long periods of time, especially if it's long-term goal. That means that whatever assumptions were created during the planning phase may be already outdated by the time of implementation or in the middle of it. That's why it's important to adjust it to the changing conditions, and that's where monitoring is so important. So if the risk management assessment was done in the first phase, it should be a little bit easier here. But to know what is changing, we need proper tracking and monitoring, and that includes leadership bodies. And if they spend less than 1 month on 1 hour of strategy per month, no wonder the strategy is failing by default. So, in short, this is the second layer. As you can see, it's a crucial layer where even the most perfectly designed plan can crumble. But even if you do everything right in this layer, in here, there is still one more layer that can make it impossible to succeed. This is where the real outcomes are determined, where strategy is actually executed or not, And in a way, this layer is so obvious, it becomes a blind spot. Everyday behavior. This is where the invisible forces we've been talking about finally take center stage. This is where the causes behind those structural patterns actually live. And how do we know that? Well, because even when the plan is solid, responsibilities are defined, progress is being tracked, something still influences what actually happens, something still stalls the successful execution of strategy. And we've already given it a name, the hidden structure, the system that becomes visible through patterns. So let's go back to the dinner party, because this is where it becomes very clear. Earlier, we said that responsibility and ownership need to align with the objective. But there is one more critical piece: authority, decision-making power. Imagine again, you're responsible for hosting that dinner party. You own the outcome, but you still can't increase the budget, ask for help, or extend the timeline. Then it doesn't matter how clear the task is, you still can't make it happen. So, what do you actually need? You need the authority to influence the outcome. So, budget to buy ingredients, ability to involve other people, flexibility to adjust time. And the moment you have that, the previously impossible tasks becomes possible. This is what we call the power responsibility gap. It's not about effort, it's not about skill. It's about being asked to succeed in a system that doesn't give you the ability to do so. And this shows up everywhere in organizations. People are held accountable for outcomes without the authority required to influence them. But now let's zoom out, because this is only one part of the system. When strategy shifts, responsibility usually moves downward. New targets, new expectations, new priorities. But the surrounding mechanisms, they often stay exactly the same. So things like decision rights. Who can actually decide what? Incentive systems. What gets rewarded or penalized? Measurement systems. What defines a good performance? So what happens then? People are now accountable for new outcomes, but still operating under yesterday's rules. And this is where behavior becomes actually predictable. Because daily behavior in organizations doesn't follow strategy documents. It allows the structure. People respond to what they are measured on, what affects their compensation, what carries career risk, what authority they actually have. If those things don't change, behavior won't change either. So let's go back to the dinner party example one more time. Imagine now you do have authority. You have a budget of 500 and you can involve 3 people. So now technically you can succeed. But there is one more thing. You are also responsible for another project and your promotion depends on that one. So what happens? You don't focus on the dinner party. Not because you don't care or you don't understand the goal, but because the system is telling you something else matters more. That's incentives. Even if everything else is aligned, if the way you're evaluated hasn't changed, then your behavior won't change either. You go back to your old priority because that's what the system rewards. And now suddenly everything that we talked about before makes sense, right? Strategy isn't failing because of people. It's failing because the system shaping behavior isn't aligned with the strategy. This is where most organizations struggle, because no amount of planning, framework, communication, meetings can override forces guiding everyday behavior. And until they are understood, and more importantly, until they are made visible, you can't do anything, because you can't change system you don't even see. Well, now you do. So let's step back. Strategy moves through 3 layers. Design, which defines direction, implementation, which creates structure, and daily behavior, which determines the outcomes. Break any of them, and the strategy falters. The stalled approvals, the repeated defaults, the misalignment, they are not random. They are signals of misalignment across these three layers. And the most important discovery today, the third layer. Because strategy doesn't succeed on paper, it succeeds or fails in how people actually behave. So understanding strategy this way matters because it captures the full picture from planning to implementation to the human dynamics that shape both. And once you see that, once you understand that process, the question changes because it's no longer what's wrong with our strategy, but what system is this strategy trying to operate in? So now we can return to the original question, what actually makes strategy succeed? Not just a good plan, not just strong execution or implementation. It's the alignment across all three layers, the strategy itself, the system that implements it, and the way people behave every day. Because at the end of the day, strategy gets executed by people. And this is where everything starts to connect. Because what we've been calling the hidden layer isn't separate from the organization. It is the organization, just the part we don't usually see or talk about. But to really understand it, we need to use the different lens, the three levels of structural clarity: leader perception, organizational structure, and outcomes. And here's the key. The everyday behavior layer we talked about today is actually part of that middle layer, the organizational structure. Just not the formal one, but the invisible one. How decisions really get made, how authority actually flows, how incentives shape priorities, and then how people behave under pressure. So, what we've uncovered today isn't just a missing piece of execution. It's the hidden part of the overall structure itself. And that's where the investigation goes next. Because if we want the strategy to work, we need to understand the system that turns it into reality.